Welcome back to AU Family Channel, and thank you so much for being here. It truly means the world to have you as one of our loyal listeners. If our stories have ever touched your heart, we are so grateful that you keep coming back to spend this time with us. So find somewhere comfortable, take a slow, deep breath, and let us begin today's story, together. Her name was Diane, and she owned a small accounting firm in our town, and she gave my mother a job when no one else would, and in doing so, she changed the entire trajectory of our family's life. My mother had a criminal record, a single mistake from her early 20s, a mistake she had spent years paying for, and by the time I was born, that mistake still followed her into every job interview, still closed doors that should have opened for a woman who had rebuilt herself so completely. Diane was the person who finally looked past the record to the person my mother had actually become, and I have spent my whole life trying to understand the debt our family owes her. I need you to understand what my mother's life looked like before Diane, because that context is the only way to understand the magnitude of what Diane eventually gave us. My mother had made a serious mistake in her early 20s, a theft charge born out of desperation and poor judgment during a hard season of her life, and she had served her time and paid her debt, in the eyes of the law, years before I was ever born. But the world does not always agree with the law about when a debt is paid. Every job application asked the question, every background check surfaced the record, and my mother, brilliant and hardworking and utterly transformed from the person who had made that mistake, spent years being turned away, again and again, by employers who saw one line on a form and decided they already knew everything they needed to know about her. I grew up watching my mother work jobs far beneath her actual abilities, cleaning houses, working retail, taking whatever employment would have her, because the careers that matched her real skills, the accounting work she had studied for and was genuinely gifted at, remained closed to her, door after door, application after application. She never complained about it in front of me, not really, but I could see the toll it took, the particular exhaustion of being brilliant and capable and locked out anyway, judged forever by the worst thing she had ever done rather than the years of hard work she had put into becoming someone entirely different. I was maybe 10 years old when Diane finally changed everything. My mother applied to Diane's small accounting firm the way she had applied to dozens of others, expecting, I think, the same rejection she had grown to anticipate, the same door closing the moment her background check came back. But Diane called her in for an interview anyway, and my mother told me, years later, that she almost did not go, certain it would be another wasted afternoon, another rejection to absorb. She went anyway, because she always went anyway, because giving up was not something my mother knew how to do, and she sat across from Diane in that small office, waiting for the conversation to end the way it always ended. But Diane asked her something no other interviewer had ever asked. She asked my mother to tell her the whole story, not just the fact of the record but the actual circumstances, the desperation that had led to it, the years since, the work my mother had done to become someone different. And my mother, startled, told her the truth, the whole difficult truth, expecting even this honesty to be held against her. And Diane listened, really listened, the way almost no one had listened to my mother in years, and at the end of the story, she said something that changed our family's entire future. She said, "That was not who you are anymore. I can see that clearly. When can you start?" I want to tell you about who Diane was, because her decision to hire my mother was not some naive impulsiveness, some failure to do her due diligence. She was a sharp, careful businesswoman who had built a successful firm through exactly the kind of judgment that made her decision about my mother so significant. She had looked at the risk, considered it seriously, and made a deliberate choice to trust her own assessment of a person's character over the flat, context-free verdict of a background check. She told my mother, later, that she had learned, over years of running her own business, that people are not fixed at their worst moment, that the most loyal, hard-working employees she had ever hired were sometimes the ones who had fought hardest to rebuild themselves after failing once. My mother started working for Diane that same month, and I remember the change in our household almost immediately, the particular quality of relief and gratitude that filled our home for the first time in years. She was doing real work now, work that matched her actual skills, work that let her use the education and the talent she had spent years unable to put to use. And more than that, she was being trusted, genuinely trusted, by an employer who had looked at her whole story and decided she was worth believing in. I did not fully understand, at 10, what that trust meant to a woman who had spent a decade being told, implicitly, by every closed door, that she was permanently defined by her worst mistake. I understand it completely now. Diane did not just give my mother a job. She gave her a chance to prove, finally, after years of being denied the opportunity, that the person she had become was real, that the transformation was not just something my mother claimed in interviews that never led anywhere but something that could be demonstrated, day after day, in real work, with real responsibility. And my mother rose to that chance with everything she had, working harder than anyone else at that firm, determined to prove that Diane's trust had not been misplaced, determined to justify the risk that one woman had taken on her when no one else would. I watched my mother transform, over the following years, in ways I did not fully understand until I was older. The particular tiredness that had characterized her for as long as I could remember, the exhaustion of being brilliant and capable and locked out, began to lift, replaced by something I had never quite seen in her before, a genuine pride in her work, a confidence that came from finally being allowed to be who she actually was. She started talking about her work at the dinner table with an enthusiasm I had never heard from her, describing problems she had solved, praise Diane had given her, responsibilities she had been trusted with. My mother was becoming, before my eyes, the person she had always had the capacity to be, if only someone had given her the chance. Diane's trust in my mother extended beyond the job itself, into something that felt, over the years, more like genuine friendship and mentorship than a simple employment relationship. She began teaching my mother aspects of the business beyond her original role, grooming her, I came to understand later, for more responsibility, more advancement, treating her not as a charity case to be tolerated but as a genuinely talented employee worth investing in. My mother rose, over the years at that firm, from an entry-level position to someone with real authority and respect, a trajectory that would have been unimaginable in the years before Diane, when every door closed the moment a background check surfaced. I remember a conversation I overheard, once, between my mother and Diane, at some office event I had been brought along to, my mother thanking Diane again, as she often did, for the chance she had been given. And Diane, in a tone I have never forgotten, told my mother to stop thanking her, that she had not done my mother a favor, she had made a good business decision, hiring one of the most talented and hard-working people she had ever employed. She said, I did not take a risk on you out of charity. I took a risk on you because I could see, clearly, in that first interview, that you were exactly the kind of person worth betting on. The record was not what I was hiring. I was hiring you. That distinction mattered enormously to my mother. I came to understand the difference between being helped out of pity and being valued for genuine talent. Diane never treated my mother's employment as an act of charity, never made her feel like a project or a redemption story to be managed. She treated her, from the very first day, as a genuinely skilled professional who happened to have a difficult chapter in her past, and that respect, that refusal to reduce my mother to her worst mistake, was, I think, as important as the job itself. My mother did not just need income. She needed to be seen, fully, as someone worth valuing, and Diane gave her that from the very beginning. I asked Diane once, years later, when I was old enough to really understand what she had done for our family, why she had taken the risk on my mother when so many other employers had not. And she told me about her own history, about a brother who had made a serious mistake in his youth, who had spent years afterward unable to find real opportunity, doors closing on him the same way they had closed on my mother, and about watching that closed door slowly destroy a talented, capable person who never got the chance to prove he had changed. She said she had decided, after watching her brother's life narrow and diminish under the weight of a past he could never escape, that if she ever had the power to give someone else that chance, she would take it seriously, every time. That conversation taught me something about the way our own wounds can become the source of our deepest kindness to others, the way Diane's grief over her brother had transformed, over the years, into a genuine practice of looking past people's worst moments to see who they had actually become. She had not hired my mother randomly, out of some abstract commitment to second chances. She had hired her because she recognized, in my mother's story, the shape of her brother's story, and she had decided, deliberately, that she was not going to let another talented person's life narrow under the weight of a past they had already paid for. I learned, watching my mother's transformation under Diane's employment, about the particular cruelty of a system that judges people permanently by their worst moment, regardless of how much they have grown or changed since. My mother had paid her legal debt years before Diane hired her, had spent a decade proving, through hard work and honest living, that she was not the person who had made that mistake. But the system kept charging her anyway, every application, every background check, an endless toll that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with a refusal to let people change. Diane was the first person who looked at that endless toll and decided it had gone on long enough. My mother worked at Diane's firm for the rest of my childhood and into my adulthood, rising eventually to a position of real seniority, training new employees herself, becoming, in her own right, exactly the kind of respected professional that a decade of closed doors had once told her she could never be. And every step of that rise, I understood, traced back to a single interview, a single moment when one woman decided to ask for the whole story instead of accepting the flat verdict of a background check, and decided, hearing that story, to bet on the person my mother had actually become. I think often about how different my childhood would have been if Diane had never made that decision, if my mother had continued the pattern of the years before, working jobs far beneath her ability, exhausted by the particular toll of being brilliant and capable and permanently locked out. I do not know if we would have survived that trajectory, financially or otherwise. I know that the stability and pride and genuine fulfillment that came into our household after Diane hired my mother reshaped everything about my own childhood, gave me a mother who was not just surviving but genuinely thriving, who came home with stories of real accomplishment instead of the quiet exhaustion of years before. I watched my mother pay Diane's kindness forward, over the years, in her own hiring decisions once she rose to a position of authority at that firm, watched her look, deliberately, for the talented people that other employers had overlooked because of some difficult chapter in their past. She told me, once, that she thought of herself as continuing something Diane had started, a practice of looking past the worst moment to the person someone had actually become, of taking calculated risks on people the world had already written off. I have watched her hire people with records similar to her own, watched her give them the same chance Diane had given her, watched the ripple of Diane's original decision extend outward, through my mother, into other lives entirely. I asked my mother, once, what it felt like, those years before Diane, to be turned away over and over for a mistake she had spent a decade paying for, and she told me it felt like being told, over and over, that she was permanently defined by the worst thing she had ever done, that no amount of growth or change or hard work would ever be enough to outrun it. She said the particular despair of that experience was not just about the practical difficulty of finding work, though that was real, but about the deeper wound of never being allowed to prove that she had become someone different, of having every door closed before she even had the chance to demonstrate the person she actually was. Diane's decision to hire my mother was, I have come to understand, an act of profound respect disguised as a simple business decision, a refusal to accept the flat, context-free verdict of a background check over her own careful assessment of a person's actual character. She trusted her own judgment, developed over years of reading people and making hiring decisions, over the crude information contained in a single line on a form. And that trust, extended to my mother at exactly the moment she needed someone to extend it, changed the entire trajectory of our family's life, lifted us out of a cycle of closed doors and quiet exhaustion into stability and genuine pride. I have thought often about the courage it must have taken Diane to make that decision, the real business risk she was accepting, hiring someone with a criminal record into a position of financial trust and responsibility. She could have been wrong. My mother could have betrayed that trust, could have proven the skeptics right, could have validated every reason other employers had for their caution. Diane took that risk anyway, based on her own careful reading of my mother's character in a single interview, and my mother spent the following decades proving, decisively, that the risk had been worth taking, that Diane's judgment had been exactly right. I went to Diane's retirement party, years later, when she finally stepped back from the firm she had built over a lifetime, and I watched my mother give a speech, in front of Diane's whole staff, about the decision that had changed our family's entire life. My mother cried, giving that speech, and so did I, listening to her describe the years before Diane, the exhaustion of being locked out, the moment in that first interview when someone finally asked for the whole story instead of accepting the flat verdict of a form. And I watched Diane, in the audience, cry too, moved, I think, by finally hearing, fully and publicly, what her decision all those years before had actually meant. I learned, from Diane's example, about the power of asking for the whole story, of refusing to let a single fact stand in for a person's entire character. She could have made her hiring decision the easy way, the way every other employer had, accepting the background check as the final word and moving on to the next candidate. Instead, she asked my mother to tell her everything, the desperation and the mistake and the years of hard work since, and she made her decision based on the whole story rather than the single damning fact. That willingness to ask, to listen, to consider context instead of accepting flat verdicts, is a discipline I try to practice in my own life, whenever I am tempted to judge someone by their worst moment instead of their whole story. I want to say something about what Diane's decision meant for the broader question of how we treat people who have made mistakes and spent years trying to become someone different. Our systems are often built to remember forever, to attach a person's worst moment to them permanently, regardless of how much growth has happened since. Diane's decision was a quiet rebellion against that system, a refusal to let a decade-old mistake define a person's entire future, a demonstration that real accountability includes, eventually, the possibility of genuine second chances. My mother had already paid her legal debt. Diane was the first person who decided that debt was actually paid, and acted accordingly. I asked Diane, at her retirement party, whether she had any idea, back in that first interview, how significant her decision would turn out to be, not just for my mother but for our entire family, for the ripple of second chances my mother had extended to others in the years since. And she said she had hoped, but she had not known, that all she had really done was trust her own judgment about a person's character, and that everything that followed, my mother's rise at the firm, the stability it brought our family, the second chances my mother had extended to others, was really my mother's accomplishment, not hers. She had just opened the door. My mother had done everything with the opportunity on the other side of it. I have carried Diane's example with me into my own life, into how I try to think about the people who have made mistakes, the applicants and colleagues and friends who carry some difficult chapter from their past that the world has decided to hold against them permanently. I try to ask for the whole story, the way Diane asked my mother, before I let a single fact stand in for a person's entire character. It is a small practice, in the scheme of things, but I have watched what it did for my mother, watched the way one woman's willingness to look past a record and see a person change the entire trajectory of our family's life, and I try, in whatever way I can, to extend that same willingness to others. Diane passed away a few years ago, and my mother spoke at her funeral, the same way she had spoken at her retirement party, about the decision that had changed everything, about the debt our family would never be able to fully repay. And I stood in that church, listening to my mother's grief for a woman who had given her a chance when no one else would, and I understood, watching the crowd of people whose lives Diane had touched over her long career, that my mother's story was not unique, that Diane had made this same kind of decision, this same kind of careful, deliberate trust, for dozens of people over the years, each of them carrying forward, in their own way, the second chance she had given them. I learned, from Diane's story, that a single decision, made carefully and deliberately by one person willing to look past a flat verdict to a whole human story, can reshape the entire trajectory of a family, can ripple outward across generations, can turn a cycle of closed doors and quiet exhaustion into stability and genuine pride. Diane did not save my mother in some dramatic, singular gesture. She simply asked for the whole story, listened carefully, and made a considered decision to trust what she heard. That decision, ordinary in its mechanics, extraordinary in its consequences, changed the entire shape of my childhood and everything that came after it. I think about the chain of second chances that Diane set in motion, extending from her own brother's story, through my mother, into every person my mother has since hired and mentored and given the same opportunity she was given. I understand, now, that I am part of that chain too, carrying forward, in whatever way my own life allows, the practice of looking past people's worst moments to the whole story underneath. It is the least I can do, honoring a decision that changed our entire family's life, made by a woman who understood that people are not fixed forever at their worst moment, and who was willing to bet, with real risk to herself, on the person my mother had actually become. There is an image I carry from my mother's stories about those years, an image of her sitting across from Diane in that small office, expecting the same rejection she had absorbed for a decade, and hearing instead a question no one had ever asked her, "Tell me the whole story." I return to that image whenever I catch myself judging someone by a single fact, a single mistake, a single line on a form, and I try to remember that there is almost always a whole story underneath, a story of growth and change and hard-won transformation that the single fact never captures. Diane asked for that story. It changed my mother's entire life. It changed mine too, though I would not be born to understand it for several more years. I learned, from my mother's example as much as from Diane's, about the particular resilience it takes to keep applying, keep trying, keep believing that somewhere, eventually, someone would look past the record to the person she had actually become. My mother could have given up, somewhere in those years of closed doors, could have accepted the verdict the world kept handing her and settled into the smaller life that verdict implied. She did not. She kept going, kept applying, kept believing that her transformation was real even when no one else would validate it, until finally, in a small accounting office, someone did. That persistence, paired with Diane's willingness to finally see it, is the whole story of how our family's life changed. If there is one thing I want you to take from Diane's story, it is the power of asking for the whole story before you let a single fact define someone permanently. So many of us carry some version of my mother's experience, some mistake or failure or difficult chapter that others have decided defines us forever, regardless of how much we have grown since. And so many of us also have the power, in our own smaller ways, to be Diane for someone else, to ask for the whole story, to look past the worst moment to the person someone has actually become, to take a considered risk on someone the world has already written off. Be that person, this week, for someone who needs exactly the chance my mother needed. You may never know how far the ripples travel. My mother still works at that firm, now under new leadership since Diane's retirement and passing, still respected, still rising, still carrying forward, in her own hiring decisions, the practice Diane taught her. And every year, On the anniversary of that first interview, she tells the story again, to me, to my own children now, a story about a debt our family will never fully repay, a story about the power of one person's willingness to ask for the whole truth instead of accepting a flat verdict. It is the story that shaped our entire family's trajectory, and I will keep telling it, the way my mother tells it, for as long as I am able. I learned, from Diane, that real courage sometimes looks like an ordinary business decision, a willingness to trust your own careful judgment over the crude, context-free verdict of a system built to remember forever. She took a real risk, hiring my mother, and that risk paid off not just in the loyal, talented employee my mother became, but in an entire family's trajectory, lifted out of exhaustion and closed doors into stability and genuine pride. I try to carry that courage forward, in my own smaller decisions, asking for the whole story before I judge, considering context before I write someone off, remembering that the person in front of me might be exactly who my mother was in that small office, waiting for someone to finally ask. So this week, I want to ask you to think about the people in your own life who might be carrying some version of my mother's experience, some mistake or failure that the world has decided defines them permanently, regardless of how much they have grown since. And I want you to consider being Diane for them, asking for the whole story, looking past the worst moment to the person they have actually become, extending the kind of considered trust that changed my mother's entire life. You do not need to own a business or make some dramatic gesture. You need only the willingness to ask, to listen, and to see the whole person in front of you. It is a small thing that can change everything. It changed everything for my family. Thank you so much for staying with me all the way to the end of this story. It truly means the world that you are here. If Diane and her quiet, courageous decision to see my mother fully moved your heart, please give this video a like and subscribe to AU Family Channel, where a brand new story is waiting for you every single week. And remember what one small accounting firm owner taught a family that had run out of chances. People are not fixed forever at their worst moment, and asking for the whole story, instead of accepting a flat verdict, can change an entire family's future. So this week, look past the worst moment to the whole story. I will see you in the next one.